About 2 weeks ago, the NTSB released an animation from the final report of the mishap on November 12, 2022, involving the midair collision of the B-17 and P-63 at an air show. We've talked about it previously on the channel. Now we have the final report and some animations. So I'm going to explain what they're talking about, talk about some lessons learned, and look at what they said about the final probable cause of the mishap.
3, 2, 1, flight off.
On November 12, 2022, about 1:22 p.m. Central Standard Time, a Boeing B-17 and a Bell P-63 collided in flight while performing in the Wings Over Dallas Air Show.
All right, just looking at these things, the visibility is not great on either aircraft. You can see here the P-63, all this stuff serves to get in the way. You know, it's not like an F-16 with a bubble canopy or even an F-18. He's pretty much cocooned in there, and you can see him trying to look at whoever's taking this picture, and there's this big bar, I guess you'd call it, in the way. So right away, this is kind of a visibility issue. And same thing with the B-17. This quadrant here and back here are going to be tough for visibility with how far the pilots are, observers, everything are forward of that wing line.
The air show was put on by the Commemorative Air Force at the Dallas Executive Airport in Dallas, Texas.
It used to be the Confederate Air Force. They renamed it.
The air show was directed via radio communications by the air boss, who stood on a set of air stairs near the center of the airport, giving him a clear view of the flying display area. The crowd was positioned on the ramp adjacent to runway 1331. The airplanes were to fly past the crowd along show lines that were 500 feet and 1,000 feet away from the crowd. The airplanes in the air show were all historic former military airplanes.
Okay, so we've got our guide here. Pink is the B-17. That's the one we'll be looking at. And orange is the P-63, or a light orange. A darker orange is a non-participating revenue flight of a PT-17.
Organized into a bomber group and a fighter formation. The bomber group was led by the accident bomber, a Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress called Raiders or Texas Raiders on the radio. The B-17 was followed by a B-24 Liberator, an SB-2C Helldiver.
Oh, cool. They put him in the bomber group.
One B-25J Mitchell, and a second B-25J Mitchell. The trailing B-25 was not broadcasting position data.
Was that ADSB?
The fighter formation was led by a P-51D Mustang called Gunfighter on the radio.
Oh, yeah. Cool call sign.
Followed by a P-51C Mustang and the accident fighter, a P-63F King Cobra.
Yeah.
A revenue flight in a Boeing PT-17 was also being directed by the air boss and landed on runway 31 just before the accident. The PT-17 was called Quebec on the radio.
Quebec.
The airshow performance relied on real-time directives from the air boss. The air boss preferred not to assign altitudes and expected the pilots to maintain separation visually.
Okay, so that is your first red flag. I haven't done air shows, but having done large deconfliction exercises, red flags, red air, large force employment exercises in fighters, altitude deconfliction is priority number one. When I would build a plan as a mission commander for a red air mission, making sure that everybody had blocks, is what they call altitude blocks, mini blocks, get well altitudes that everybody could go to and have deconfliction to know that they were safe, was priority one, even on a day, visual meteorological conditions kind of day where you could see everything. It's just a safety factor that I don't know if this is standard, but it's certainly something that needs to be included in any planning of what altitude we're going to be at so we don't run into each other between groups.
During the air show, the fighters generally flew higher than 1,000 feet above the ground, and the bombers generally flew below 1,000 feet.
And that's fine if that's written somewhere or if that is what we know. But as we'll see here, when they ran into each other, nobody was at these sanctuary altitudes. It was much different for the reason that they're going to talk about here in a second.
However, during the final maneuver, the fighters descended to gain speed to cross in front of the bombers as directed.
So that's what you do for formation position. It was a big thing in the T-38. I'm sure the A-10's similar. In F-16s and F-18s, you could kind of fix stuff with your left hand, i.e. throttle, if you needed to gain position. But we use geometry a lot. And I'll talk about the geometry in this turn of where it probably should have happened. But if you need to gain speed and get in front of something, trading altitude for airspeed is the quickest way to do that and burns the least amount of fuel because, you know, you're not throttling up to get there. You're using geometry and altitude to do that.
Following animation will combine the recorded radio communications and the global positioning system based ground tracks. Altitude above the ground is shown next to the legend for the two colliding airplanes. The animation begins in the middle of the air show a few minutes before the collision.
Fighters, you can walk your way up to the B-17. I'm going to break y'all out after this. You're going to end up breaking left. So you're going to follow the bombers to the right 90 out, and then you're going to roll back in left and be on the 500-foot line if y'all want to set up an echelon for a break so y'all can get in trail.
So a lot of words to set up this next thing. It's almost like they're choreographing stuff on the fly.
Okay, say again for the fighters. That was
And the P-51 lead is like, what?
Fighters, go echelon right. Go to echelon right. Okay, fighters, echelon right. Okay, B-24, if you can give me a couple of inches and close the gap, I'd appreciate it.
So the B-24 is kind of not, as you can see, yellow. There's a big gap here. So they're telling them, hey, push it up. Inches being inches of manifold pressure, I guess, to close that distance between the two aircraft.
B-17, let's keep the turn a little flat for me. And just a little bit. When you come back through, you're coming through on the 1,000-foot line. Here's Roger. American fighters should be in a right turn. You're going to follow the bombers out on a right 90 turn, and then I'm going to roll you back in front of them. I needed to drop it.
Okay, so he says, I'm going to do a right 90 turn and then roll you back in front of them. So this is they already know this plan here, but they're in trail, right? So they know they're going to come back around.
Down to the deck, runway 31, clear to land. Clear to land, down to the deck, fire to land. There you go, B-17. Yep, gentle, flat, roll it around, 1,000-foot line. Foot line for Raiders.
So they're putting this flight behind the brownish orange PT-17.
Fighters, roll it back to the left. Lead, fighter lead, roll it back to the left, and y'all get in trail. Okay, fighters.
So they have the fighter lead roll it back to the left to get in trail at this point. But yet, eventually, they want him in front. So this is where it gets kind of confusing, I mean, to me. Right now, altitude deconfliction-wise, we're only 100 feet. So we're not adhering to traditionally 1,000, 1,100. But you're also overpopulated areas, towers, stuff like that over here, this side of the city.
Yep, and gunfighter, look out your left side and find the B-17. See the 17. Yeah, there you go. Roll it back to the left. I want you to get in front of the bombers. I want you to come through on the outside edge of the runway.
Okay, so he told him to go in trail. Now he's telling him to get in front of him.
Okay.
This is just a gaggle back here. Our P-63 is when you're -4, -3, you're at the end of the formation. You're like the tail end of the whip. So everything that happens is exaggerated. And so with the flailing lead trail, he's just getting spit out farther and farther aft. But remember, we talked about 1,500 feet, 830 feet. Okay, we got altitude deconfliction here. We're fine.
Wind check now. Winds are estimated 330 at 12 gust 18.
So they told him to go and lead.
Nice job, fighters. You're coming through first. That will work out. B-17 and all the bombers on the 1,000-foot line.
So here's the problem. I'm glad they did the circles here. When you do a rejoin, when you do anything with geometry, you have lead, lag, and pure pursuit. So we're right now, our goal is to be here, lined up, 1,000-foot line in lead of this. The problem is we started out here in trail, and then he said be in lead. The reality should have been to cut the corner here. But we floated. I mean, if this were BFM, I would say they're doing lag BFM on the B-17 because they flush out and then come back around. Versus if he had made this decision here, they could have squared the corner. Now, you might say, well, the PT7 or the PT-17 is in the way, but he's landing. It won't be a conflict if you're at 1,000 feet or even 500 feet because that PT-17 is landing. He's not doing an overhead. Instead, what we get is 3 aircraft that are not really, they're in kind of a lead trail. So they're not one element. They're kind of displaced. And a B-17 that realistically, if this were to work, would need to float it. He needed to tell him, 90 right over here to get out of the way, because now the geometry is such that they're both going to the same position in space. All they have is speed to make that work. And that's why they're going to descend, is to make that speed happen.
B-17, you got the fighters in front of you off your left?
So he might say yes. We don't know what he says, but he sees 2 fighters. The P-63 got spit way out here, back here, when this happened.
Nice.
And so the B-17 probably is thinking deconfliction. I'm going to stay below 1,000 feet. I'm going to go low and give them more altitude. But meanwhile, this P-63 is so far in trail, he doesn't have an option. He has to ramp down to get that speed back, to get rejoined with his flight and get in front of here. So this is a very compressed timeline, and you can see the lines. We needed to be turning way sooner than we did. We flushed out back here, and now we're in a situation where there's a 0 line of sight rejoin. And by 0 line of sight, I mean, if he could see the B-17 on his canopy, it wouldn't be moving. It would be staying stationary in his canopy. The problem is, as we talked about with the visibility, he's belly up because he's in a left-hand turn, which puts the wing in front of his line of sight to the B-17, and has already got crappy visibility because it's a P-63.
Nice job, fighters. Come on through.
B-17's not helping matters because he's down low, but if the assumption was bombers below 1,000, fighters above 1,000, he's doing all he can. He's doing what he's supposed to be doing. He's giving them plenty of room in deconfliction, saying, I'm going to make sure that we're altitude deconfliction. And this goes back to the air boss and the planning of not setting mini blocks and not setting get well altitudes and Beano lines and such. That would be the other part too, is if you had a Beano line and said, hey, the B-17 needs to be, north of this or northeast of this. And if the B-17 had rolled out and gone north of this line here, that could have worked out too, a geographical deconfliction. But with no altitude or geographical deconfliction, we're in a position where this is about to be very bad.
Fighters will be a big pull up and to the right.
And the air boss isn't even worried about it. He's looking at these guys right here because they are closest to him. Probably doesn't even notice that this is about to happen because he's worried about what's next. Air boss is thinking multiple steps ahead because this is kind of on the fly versus pre-planned, choreographed, etc. And there's the mishap right there. I mean, you think big sky theory just didn't work out this time because they were at the same altitude at the same time. 230 feet right there. And that'll be a collision here at 220 feet. And the B-17 is doing all he can to get out of the way. I mean, what else is he going to do?
The following is a video taken from the area of the crowd that starts with the B-17 and the P-63 about 4 seconds before the impact. The left bank of the P-63 obscured the pilot's view of the B-17.
Yep.
The B-17 pilot,
we talk about this when we teach rejoins or talk rejoins in the Air Force, belly up rejoins. You don't want to be belly up co-altitude with somebody because you're obscured. Your view is obscured. So you either want to be stacked low or you want to be aft or you want to have some kind of geographical or geometrical deconfliction or altitude deconfliction.
likely did not see the P-63 as it came from behind the B-17's left wing.
He has no idea. He's just rolling out doing his thing. That's terrible.
The accident was the air bosses and airshow event organizers' lack of an adequate pre-briefed aircraft separation plan for the airshow performance, relying instead on the air boss's real-time deconfliction directives and the see and avoid strategy for collision avoidance.
Can't do that.
Also causal was the diminished ability of the pilots to see and avoid other aircraft due to flight path geometry, view obscuration by aircraft structures, attention demands associated with the airshow performance, and the inherent limitations of human performance. A risk assessment for each show.
So they recommended
and a debriefing after each show that includes feedback to the Federal Aviation Administration and the International Council of Air Shows.
Well, again, I talk about there by the grace of God go I. It's easy to Monday morning quarterback this kind of stuff. Sitting at 1G, this is, people hate talking about Swiss cheese, but this is the Swiss cheese model. When you are on the fly, making stuff up as you go, and don't have a solid deconfliction plan, unfortunately, things like this happen. Now, had it worked out years prior? Probably. Was it something that could have worked out if they were just lucky? Yeah. Sometimes it is better to be lucky than good. Unfortunately, in this case, luck ran out. And if he had had a God's eye view and looked at it, he'd have said, well, fighters, start your turn now, cut that corner. And instead of going all the way south, now he might have had other reasons to do it the way he did it. I don't know. He may not have just been thinking about it. It seems to me that it would be very overwhelming. But in a situation like that, you need get well altitudes, either lateral or geographical deconfliction, or you need some kind of altitude deconfliction. This is the stuff we did all the time as Red Air with large force. We'd had 15, 16, 20 aircraft even. And we would have a Beano line where you don't cross it for geographical deconfliction. And then you had mini blocks, and then you had altitude blocks. So you had altitude blocks like, if the fighters are, 1,000 to 1,500, and then each fighter would be 1,100, 1,200, 1,300. And then the bombers would be, 900, 800, 700. That way, if you lose sight for a second, you still have your get well altitude. It may not look as pretty, but what's more important, looking good or not dying? So having that altitude deconfliction, having that geographical deconfliction, because this could have been avoided too if the B-17 had been limited, in this case, to north of the line, because that would have kept them south and they could have made the rejoin happen. If they had had the south of the line, that wouldn't have worked because you still would have been having to cross. So it just didn't work out the way that it probably should have. And a lot of that was planning. Sometimes it goes all the way back to the brief. And so unfortunately now it's the loss of life. And now we have to talk about what can we do to make things better. I didn't know that they didn't have this kind of deconfliction plan. They may have. This video might not be telling the whole story. And there may have been a geographical deconfliction plan, but obviously it didn't work out here. So, it's tough to throw any one person under the bus because everybody sat in the brief and everybody was okay with it enough that they went to fly. Nobody raised their hand and say, no, we need blocks and deconfliction and stuff like that. It's stuff that we can learn from. It's stuff that we can get better from. And no one is above making mistakes. And unfortunately, this time, sometimes the mistakes happen and it's just, we learn from it. And sometimes it's results in a loss of life and the FAA rolling in and saying, now you're going to do it this way. So very tragic. Feel for the families and those that lost loved ones. I'm not saying I could do it better. I'm just saying sometimes, you have to go back all the way to the mission planning phase to figure out what went wrong. So let me know in the comments what you think. We'll see you next time.